This is a KinnPorsche. Until we meet again in the series, crossover podfic of Dessert for Two by Solitary Bird. This fic is rated T for dead hedgehogs, implied reference child abuse, dead fathers, and Vegas finally going to therapy. Vegas goes to his first therapy session, and Pete rewards him for taking care of himself. It's a Thai dessert that he's learned to cook from this kid on YouTube called Pharm. "What's this?" says the author, jingling a set of keys before she puts the story on the floor and runs away. It had taken months of gentle convincing on Pete's part, but Vegas had finally agreed to get some therapy. He deserved to have somewhere safe to talk about the horrors his father had brought upon him in Macau. Macau had been placed in therapy the moment Pete was officially named as a guardian alongside his older brother. It was Vegas who had sheltered him from as much as he possibly could, but he was still a child that had witnessed things no child should have to. Vegas had made it absolutely clear to Pete that he didn't feel comfortable talking to him about this part of his life. It was a part of himself he had sectioned away behind solid doors Pete had only seen behind once, upon the death of his beloved hedgehog, the last hedgehog, the last thing he'd ever been given from his father, who was now dead. Since his father's death, in a way Vegas had been freed from the tethers the man had placed upon him. In others he was only more entangled. It was something that stabbed at Pete's heart. If anyone deserved to be free of the shadow their father had cast upon them, it was his Vegas. They hadn't become a couple under the best of circumstances, or in any way that could be considered as conventional, but what they had worked for both of them, each finding stability in the other, doing their best to navigate the turbulent waters that flowed between the minor and major families after the failed coup, and they did that together. Vegas choosing to go to therapy made Pete so happy, even though he was practically shaking right now as he was waiting for him to return. The anticipation over who would walk through that door was making him jittery. What if he hated it? What if the publicly acceptable social facade he'd carefully created cracked and he needed Pete to help him put it back together again? What if he came back the sort of angry where he paced for hours and needed Pete to hold him tightly? Pete would console him. Pete would crack too. They could be themselves around one another. Pete would hold him as long as he needed to be grounded in order not to explode. Right now, though, what Pete really needed was something to do. Normally, Porsche would have rang him about some sort of minor catastrophe that was happening, or Tankun texting promises of another all-day movie marathon with popcorn and this new cocktail Porsche had taught him how to make. Someone in the Minor family might have brought paperwork for him to fill out, or some small dispute to preside over. There was, however, nothing to do but continue his semi-panic over Vegas. He couldn't even distract himself with making Macau do his homework. The boy was out with friends and wouldn't be back until Sunday night. If he was going to prevent losing his mind over the next 4 hours, then the therapist's office was an hour away and they wanted to do a 2-hour introductory session. Pete was going to have to find something to do. He'd scrolled through what felt like hundreds of YouTube videos looking for the perfect thing to make as a present for Vegas. He really wanted to reward him for making this hard step, and none of their usual activities really seemed appropriate to do with a potentially emotionally vulnerable man. There were so many recipes that were boring or way too hard to do. Pete still only really had what his lover would call survival cooking skills, or needed so many ingredients that it would take all day to make, even if you were a chef. Who has tarragon? What even is tarragon? Somehow, Pete stumbled across a channel that drew his interest. It didn't have many videos, but they were all recipes for uncommon, traditional Thai desserts. He expected the owner of the channel would be some old lady whose grandchild had helped make the account, someone's grandma, but they weren't. The video panned up from the chopping board to show a small, cute-looking young man He smiled awkwardly and stammered his way through an explanation of the history and meaning behind the dish. In the background, you could hear another man quietly encouraging him. If it had been anyone else telling him how to make this dish, Pete would have been annoyed by the stilted speech and wobbly camera work, but Pharm's voice was comforting. He just had so much love for all the foods he was making and a way of explaining what to do that Pete, who had survived on various instant foods for a large part of his life before entering the ranks of the Tira Panyukun bodyguards, could follow along. Pharm just had a way of talking that soothed Pete. He couldn't really put his finger on. Maybe this is the type of feeling that people who love ASMR channels talk about, he thought, making note of the channel name to pass along to Porsche, who loved that sort of thing. Red string between our bowls. It was a very poetic name, and it obviously held some sort of meaning for the owner. He'd never thought that he would be spending his afternoon folding lotus flower petals, but here he was. They might have come out very wonky, and maybe a few had unwrapped themselves as they were steamed, but to Pete it felt like a victory. There wasn't a lot of time left before Vegas was due back home once Pete had placed the little desserts on a plate, but he made sure to clean up Vegas's kitchen. It was a place Pete rarely had to enter, as Vegas was more than happy to feed Pete whenever he wanted, whatever he wanted. It was a part of the way Vegas loved him, being his live-in chef, catering all his meals with perfectly balanced nutrition. Pete had never thought about riboflavin in his life before living with the man. In fact, he'd never even heard of it, but now he knew he was definitely getting enough of it. The look his personal chef had given him when he had read with permission Pete's blood work and noticed he was vitamin D deficient whilst living in a tropical climate was particularly memorable. It had led to the tofu and bean debacle that was best left unremembered. When Vegas returns, he looks rattled and seems a little fragile, but he's smiling and open to being hugged by Pete, who takes full advantage of the opportunity. "What have you been up to, pet?" Vegas asked, his hand stroking the front of the black apron Pete is still wearing. He'd forgotten to take it off after he'd become distracted cleaning up the mess in the kitchen. "I made you some dessert," Pete said, picking up the plate and showing Vegas, who was now smiling at him with the sort of smile he only bestowed on Pete during important occasions. The sort of smile where Pete got to see him actually unguarded and wholly himself. Vegas picked up one of the desserts from his offered plate. He delicately unwrapped the little dessert from the fragile petal it was residing in, popping it into his mouth and chewing slowly. Pete picked up one of his own. Thank you for making me go there," Vegas whispered into Pete's ear. It was barely audible, but he'd heard it all the same. As they hugged, standing on the quiet kitchen, a small pile of steamed lotus petals slowly began to form on the counter. In the morning, Pete makes sure to write Pharm a glowing recipe review and a comment under his YouTube video. "I made this dessert for my husband yesterday. He's been having a really hard time and just started therapy. He usually cooks for us, and I wanted to relieve some of his burden. I was worried at first that this recipe would be too advanced for me, but you're really good at explaining things in a way that's easy to understand. Thank you for helping me make my husband smile for the first time in a while. You made me promise to make him this dish every time he has an appointment as a treat. Can anyone recommend a recipe with papaya in it?" Vegas had asked him to make more late in the night, as they were laying beside each other sweating in the summer heat. Pete had easily agreed. If spending 3 hours folding lotus petals around desserts was the price to pay to get Vegas to attend therapy sessions of his own free will, then he would gladly oblige. There would be no complaints. Others might find it hard to believe that the man who had ripped off people's fingernails for fun found therapy scary, but Pete could see it written in the tense way Vegas had been holding himself, the way he kept glancing towards the doors, keeping himself between them and Pete, drawing all their blinds and constantly checking the GPS tracker he had on Macau. Considering everything that had happened to both of them, all of this made sense. It was just heartbreaking. Vegas was his rock, holding him steady, stopping Pete from floating away. If Vegas was his rock, then Pete was a boy, floating at the surface of the treacherous waters they both tread, a reminder that there was a way out, that Vegas didn't have to drown alone in memories that had no right to pull him down again. Author's note. I don't know what this is, but I did write it because I was scared to go to this therapeutic arts thing I started going to recently, which probably explains a lot, really, when I stop and think about it. Shh, nothing I write is self-insert at all. What are you talking about? You mean writing isn't meant to be carving parts of yourself off and showing them to the people via words? I'm so sorry, I've been doing this the wrong way the whole time. None of this happened. You didn't see anything written by this author. Runs away. The end. Thank you for listening.